Shut up and sit down.
Welcome back to Nerd Safari. I am still Ellie for the time being. Today we're going to be talking about 1984 cult classic Gremlins.
Gremlins, huh? Little monsters.
Right.
Hundreds of them.
Well, I don't know, maybe thousands.
Now, when researching this movie, I was surprised to find out the word gremlin was actually coined by Roald Dahl, famous for his somewhat dark children's books and adult stories that are well worth looking into. His original story, Gremlin Lore, about mischievous elves that were said to cause unexplained damage on Royal Air Force planes, was actually commissioned by Walt Disney, but the cartoon was never made. Now, just like the Roald Dahl stories, this movie is a very sweet and charismatic, but very dark horror comedy, kind of aimed at children, but kind of not. It doesn't hold back on the horror. And I think at that age, we just loved being a little bit too scared, our parents getting a little bit nervous. Where's this movie going? It's nice to have that kind of edge, and I think that's why we love it. Now let's talk trivia. The set for Kingston Falls is actually the same one used for Back to the Future in 1985. Both movies were filmed on the Universal Studios backlot right before it all burned to the ground. Coincidence? Yes, probably. The colouring of Gizmo, including the white patch of fur around his right eye, was actually directly modelled after one of producer Steven Spielberg's dogs. Extra cute. Now, they did make an earlier attempt while they were exploring their options to have monkeys play the Gremlins. They abandoned that plan because the test monkey, a spider monkey, panicked when made to wear a gremlin hood, understandable, ended up tearing director Joe Dante's office apart and shitting everywhere. So luckily, they moved on to animatronics. Now, the Gizmo puppets ended up being almost as frustrating. They broke down a lot. Consequently, to satisfy the crew, they included the well-known scene where the Gremlins hang Gizmo on a wall and throw darts at him. This was actually included on a list that the crew drew up that was known to them as the horrible things to do to Gizmo list. Now, very little of what is said by Gizmo and the Gremlins is scripted. It isn't really words, it's mostly ad-lib nonsense and noises by voice artist Howie Mandel. But to this end, Howie Mandel recorded Gizmo's lines phonetically for foreign dubs of the movie, giving them a little local tweak occasionally. And localized dialogue and in-jokes helped make this movie incredibly successful with audiences worldwide. Director Joe Dante adds that one of the many reasons this movie did so well overseas is because they did tailor these little elements specifically for each country. So for instance, in Germany, in the bar scene, they were singing German drinking songs. Now, you remember one of the rules about how much Gizmo hated bright lights.
3.
No.
What happened?
He hates bright lights.
In 1984, it was still very challenging to navigate the special effects arena, especially for these gremlins and puppets that were so incredibly problematic and challenging. By keeping them in the dark, this camouflaged the problem, and it is an old sci-fi trick that if you watch any horror movie from up until fairly recently, the darkness added mystery and malice to many a technically flawed movie monster. Now, how about some Easter eggs and cameos? If you remember at the start of this movie, the movie theatre in the town is showing A Boy's Life and Watch the Skies. You can see the posters on the outside of the movie theatres. Now, A Boy's Life and Watch the Skies were the working titles for executive producer Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And through the rest of the movie, if you keep a close eye, there are several other not too subtle nods to Spielberg's other blockbuster movies, so look out for those too. In addition, when we are at the convention at the beginning for the inventors, you'll see the time machine prop from the movie The Time Machine from 1960. You can see that on the convention floor, and a moment later the machine has disappeared into the future or the past, to the astonishment of several convention goers. Now, if you look closely at some of those other convention goers also attending the convention, you may spot Steven Spielberg, Jerry Goldsmith, and also Robbie the Robot. Later on in the movie, we also see cartoonist Chuck Jones. Now, as we follow Randall Peltzer on his way through Chinatown to the antique store, you will see a wrecked car with the hood up and steam coming out. That car is an AMC Gremlin. Another thing often missed is it's not clearly visible, but if you keep a close eye, the book 4 Magic Moves to Winning Golf by Joe Dante Sr., yes, the director's dad, is on Billy's nightstand. Director Joe Dante Jr. said his father criticized him for not making the title more visible. Now, what about the movie we almost got? Originally, Stripe and Gizmo were intended to be the same character. Gizmo was due to turn evil once he ate after midnight. This changed when executive producer Steven Spielberg, who has a good eye for these things, insisted that one of the Gremlins should be a good guy with whom the audience could identify, and maybe we could sell some merchandising too. Now, this did mean that Gizmo doesn't really do much in the second half of the movie and caused yet more headaches for those poor puppeteering team who had to build puppets with additional functionality to match his updated role and new functions. Now, remember the Santa story that we heard?
I was 9 years old. Me and Mom were decorating the tree, waiting for Dad to come home from work.
You remember the one. It was quite controversial. The studio really did not want it included. They wanted it removed. They felt it was just too ambiguous. Was it supposed to be sad? Was it supposed to be funny? Do we laugh? Do we feel bad? It's kind of creepy as well.
The police began a search. 4 or 5 days went by. Neither one of us could eat or sleep.
Director Joe Dante felt really strongly about this story. He said it represented the movie as a whole, and the whole movie is kind of that different contradictory elements. It has a combination of horrific and comedic elements. It's funny and it's horrifying.
The house was freezing, so I went to try to light up the fire, and that's when I noticed the smell.
Executive producer Steven Spielberg also didn't like the scene, but despite him having creative control, he viewed this movie as Dante's project and wanted his voice to be heard and allowed him to leave it in. That vision, I think, really held up.
And me and Mom were expecting them to pull out a dead cat or a bird.
Now, the original script contained numerous scenes that featured incredibly graphic violence and gore, far more than we already saw in a pretty gory movie for this age group. Now, that movie would certainly have led to the final movie getting an R rating. And working together, director Joe Dante and executive producer Steven Spielberg from the beginning intended to keep in some of the violence to keep the movie's edge, but rewrite just enough to ensure that the movie could pass with a PG rating, which was always their intent from the beginning. There are rumors swirling that an R-rated cut of this movie does exist, but that is inaccurate. It was always intended to be PG.
And that's how I found out there was no Santa Claus.
Now, can you think of another family favorite movie that scared you just a little bit around this time? Yes, this movie and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which came out in 1984, are jointly credited with inspiring the MPAA to create, specifically for these, the PG-13 rating. Many felt that these movies were too violent for a PG rating, but not quite violent enough for an R rating. This is certainly the kind of category that I enjoy quite a lot of. Kind of scary, but not too scary. After watching Tim Burton's earlier short films, the executive producer Steven Spielberg did seriously consider having him direct this movie. He ended up deciding against it. At the time, Tim Burton was fairly unknown. He had a strong vision, but he had never directed a full feature-length movie. But just imagine a Tim Burton version of Gremlins. They'd all have black and white stripes and really curly tails and probably like creepy bat wings and stuff. So there you have it. Gremlins is well worth revisiting. It is just as fun as you remember and probably won't scare you as much this time. And please remember to tip your delivery folk. Just maybe don't get them wet. Don't feed them after midnight either. Like, not because they might be gremlins, but just because it would be really weird. Thank you so much from Nerd Safari. Please like and subscribe. And why don't you try out some of our other videos, because they're pretty similar to this one and pretty cool.
Shut up and sit down.